true. By the way, that's why when Nikola Tesla died, the FBI swooped into his apartment and confiscated all of his secret papers. And how do I know this? I have a document from the Department of Defense demanding that the FBI turn them over and names them for what they are, the secret papers of Nikola Tesla. This is not an urban myth. I have that document. It came in this cache of documents I'm talking about. So when you have all of that knowledge, it's then augmented, increased, potentiated by the study of, as the Wilbur-Smith document says, the material that was interstellar. Because you need specialized materials. You need control systems. You need integrated circuits, which we did not have in the 40s, which came from this. You need fiber optics. You need all kinds of stuff. So some of the technologies, and this is where Colonel Corso, who worked on these projects tangentially, is correct. If you read The Day After Roswell, he says fiber optics, integrated circuits, and a whole slew of things came from studying the material from these crashed ET interstellar objects. So you had the biggest and most top secret, most well-funded project in the history of the United States going on. Nobody knew about it. It's completely sub rosa. It was more secret than the hydrogen bomb. And so between 1945 and 1954, the brain power of those Nazi aerospace folks like Wernher von Braun and Hermann Oberth, the work of T. Townsend Brown and others, Edward Teller, some of the brightest and most ingenious people in the world, bent their attention primarily not to the hydrogen bomb, but to gravity control and how are these interstellar visitors getting here? Because that would then be the ultimate edge, wouldn't it, in the technological arms race. You talk about a delivery system. You don't need an intercontinental ballistic missile that goes a few thousand miles an hour if you can deliver something instantly from one continent to another, or worse, from one planet to another. You begin to see the implications of this for national security. Therefore, it was managed in an extraordinary fashion. And the secrecy around it was increasingly ruthless. So much so that by 1956, the President of the United States, a man named Dwight Eisenhower, most of us drive on Eisenhower-era highways using 1880s Mercedes-type internal combustion engine cars that are run by fossil fuels, all of which have been obsolete since the 1940s or sooner. But Eisenhower was a five-star general, became president, two-term president, and was a Republican, very patriotic, but also very naively trusting. Jackie Gleason, the very famous comedian, his wife were friends with some folks that had been on my team before they passed away, and said that Eisenhower on his deathbed was a very bitter man over what happened to him between 1954 and when he left office in early 1961 when Jack Kennedy became the President of the United States. And in 1956, a man named Nelson Rockefeller, who later, of course, became vice president, and prior to that was an operative in the military-industrial complex and the emerging deep national security state. Nelson headed up what's called the Rockefeller Commission. And the Rockefeller Commission in 1956 reorganized the Pentagon, Department of Defense, CIA, the whole alphabet soup of secret entities. And they did so in such a way that it became labyrinthine, Byzantine, almost impossible to penetrate by anyone who wanted to navigate through it. In the early days, there was still some presidential knowledge. We have one of our witnesses, Mr. Lovkin, who is an attorney, who was a young man, White House Signal Corps here at the White House down the street from where we're speaking today. You can look at his testimony on our website, SiriusDisclosure.com, and he said, yes, he would be at meetings, and Eisenhower would be making doodles, pictures of UFOs and ET craft. In fact, I have one sitting in my condo here in D.C. that someone lifted from the archives. I won't say where and how. And he said basically Eisenhower voiced to him great frustration over the fact that there were all these projects going on and he had lost control of the oversight of them. So what happened with the Rockefeller Commission in 1956 is that they made it virtually impossible for any ordinary congressman or president, because they come every 4 to 8 years, don't they? So by the time they leave, even if they're there 8 years, maybe they're a little less wet behind the ears. But it's a system that guarantees their ignorance, except to the extent that they want to give you just enough information to control what's going on. We'll get into this in a moment. So by the time Eisenhower left office, he made the very famous speech about beware the military-industrial complex, as you've seen in the film Sirius. By the way, Sirius became #1 on Netflix a few months ago. Cool. Thank you guys for supporting that. And the president said it will become a threat to our national security and our way of life. Not the UFOs, the secrecy. No less a figure the same year, Admiral Roscoe Hillenkoetter, who was the first director of the CIA. Go look this document up. I mean, I have more documents than we have time for me to go through. And it's a letter where he's writing and saying that the secrecy around the UFO subject is a threat to our national security and to the United States. This is the first CIA director, because he also later found out he was being Schmidt-canned, pushed aside by these neo-fascists who had taken over the intelligence community, the aerospace community, and the large corporations. What happened over those years, from 1947 until 1956, was that there was a deliberate, albeit imperceptible initially, takeover by the corporate state. Corporations working with unacknowledged special access projects, which are completely off the radar, not funded officially, took over operations. And as a result of that, those national security programs increasingly became out of reach for the president, out of reach for members of Congress, or even cabinet level people like CIA directors and secretaries of state and people of this sort. So this was a gradual thing that happened, but there was an abrupt change by 56. By 1961, when Eisenhower left office, frankly, we were done. It was done. Now, I couldn't do anything about that at that point. Couldn't run the Disclosure Project because I was only 5 years old, or 6. And so it just suffered and went along. And the national security apparatus got bigger and bigger and bigger. When Jack Kennedy took over in January of 1961, he had a great interest in this, and he was, in fact, briefed on the subject. But as we know from Lieutenant Halt, who was on the early meetings I had that ironically Nelson's brother Lawrence Rockefeller, who is the white hat in the Rockefeller clan, who actually wanted to end secrecy on the subject. Lawrence Rockefeller was a very early supporter of CSETI and the Disclosure Project. And he funded and I organized the Asilomar Monterey gathering of KGB, CIA, astronauts, cosmonauts in 1995. And what I found is that some of the people who came had been involved with the Kennedy administration. And one of these gentlemen, this lieutenant colonel, was on Air Force One flying to Berlin when Kennedy made that very famous speech, "I am a Berliner," although I think he misspoke it a little, but from what I hear from the Germans. But on that flight, this Air Force officer, who was sort of like the chief steward who sort of ran Air Force One for the president, had a chat. And this issue came up because he had been a pilot who had seen one of these UFOs as an Air Force pilot. And there are thousands of sightings like this that we have in our archive. And he brought this up to the president. He says, "Oh, yes, I know about this." He says, "I've been briefed on it a little bit. But," and now I'm quoting, I have this audio tape. It is chilling, the audio tape. But he says, "Unfortunately, the whole matter," this is the president speaking, "the whole matter is out of my hands, and I don't know why," and began to cry. So we know, and that was 1963, June of 63, and of course he was killed in November. But before that, some other tragic things happened. There are a lot of tragedies here. The main thing being the loss of almost a century of evolution by the human race, which is why I left medicine. I always tell people, I used to say try to save a life one at a time. Now we have to do something to save the entire human race and planet from what is a disastrous situation that's developed. So I just say that now all of us have to work together because our patient is Gaia, the Earth, and her 7 billion children. But if you look at this document, the next one, this is a very dangerous document to have. I'm going to have to give you the provenance of this. This is the Marilyn Monroe document. It's basically a death warrant for poor Marilyn Monroe. And you look at the date on it, 3 August 1962. They found her dead the 5th of August. It's signed by James Jesus Angleton III at the bottom. Project Moondust up at the top, and Project 46. These are correct code names and code numbers for UFO ET related projects by the agency as of that date. And as you read through it, and it gives some background, it's a wiretap summary if you look at the top of it. I know it's a very degraded document, but it's a wiretap summary of telephone conversations between Marilyn Monroe and Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, and a guy named Rothberg, who was an art dealer in New York. And they were tapping Marilyn's phone because she had had tryst, as it says here, with the president. And everyone knows now she had an affair with both Jack Kennedy and Robert Kennedy. And in pillow talk, the president had told her some things. And it says one such secret that she was going to divulge in a news conference mentions the visit by the president at a secret airbase for the purpose of inspecting things from outer space. I don't think they're talking about meteorites. Kilgallen, who had been a reporter who dug into this, replied that she knew what might be the source of the visit. In the mid-50s, Kilgallen learned of a secret effort by US and UK governments to identify the origins of crashed spacecraft and dead bodies from a British government official. That was Lord Mountbatten. Kilgallen believed the story, who was later blown up by an IRA bomb, or so it was made to appear. Kilgallen believed the story may have come from the New Mexico crash in the late 40s, clear reference to the Roswell event. And she said that if the story is true, it would cause terrible embarrassment to Jack and his plans to have NASA put men on the moon, because we were using old rockets from the 40s when this secret organization already had anti-gravity under control. The subject repeatedly called the Attorney General and complained about the way she was being ignored by the president. The subject threatened to hold a press conference and would tell all, underline in the original document. That's not my underlining. The subject made references to bases in Cuba and knew of the president's plan to kill Castro. And number 5, the subject made references to her diary of secrets and what the newspapers would do with such disclosures. 2 days later, she's found dead. Now, this document, how did I get it? It's top secret, and it has not been declassified, and it is authentic. A man whose family helped found the National Security Agency, NSA, was so supportive of what the work I was doing that he appeared one day with this document. And it was a huge, one of those old Xerox from a big, government Xerox machine. The original I have in my vault is quite impressive. And he says, you need to know the kinds of things. I think he was not trying to scare me off, but he was wanting me to know the kinds of things that have been done to people who tell these kind of secrets. And so he gave me this document, and as soon as I saw it, I suspected it was legitimate. Later, I had it inspected by a man who I don't wish to name, but he was the officer who was General Odom, O-D-O-M, who was head of the NSA for years. He was General Odom's right-hand guy, literally carried his briefcase. And he became a document authenticator and a lecturer at University of Maryland who, frankly, when he looked at it, he says, without me taking it from the vault myself, I can tell you 95% certainty it's authentic, because everything in it. So basically what happened is that Marilyn Monroe was being jilted by the Kennedys because it was becoming too well known they were having an affair. The Kennedys did not order her assassination. Angleton did. Now, who is Angleton? Angleton was the big, whole books have been written about this guy. James Jesus Angleton III was the guy who at the CIA was the big mole hunter. He was the guy who would chase down anywhere a leak was coming from and had everyone tapped. And he realized that she was about to light this up and hold a press conference to talk about the ET bodies from outer space and all these secrets that Jack Kennedy had told her just out of spite. She was just furious that they had sort of pushed her out of the inner circle. And, the whole thing about a woman scorned. But unfortunately for Marilyn, it cost her her life. I later, after I got this document, met with a man who at that time had worked in the intelligence unit of the Los Angeles Police Department, who separately had a wiretap on her in her home, who confirmed to me this was 100% true. Now, I don't know how many of you know a guy named Burl Ives, who's an actor and singer, and everyone thinks he was like Frosty the Snowman, but he was actually a very accomplished actor and folk singer, and very good friends with Marilyn Monroe, Elizabeth Taylor, people like that. And he was on my executive committee for a number of years, and by the time he was involved, I had that document, and I went to visit him. They had moved from Montecito and Santa Barbara up to Anacortes, Washington. And I was in his room. I was actually sitting on the edge of his bed. He was up there in years, big jolly guy, great bear of a guy. And I shared this document with him. He says, oh my God. And he's a 33rd degree Mason, by the way. He says, we all know, every one of us knew Marilyn had been killed, but we never knew why. We had no idea why. And this is why. This is the thing. And so that was also a shot across the bow to the Kennedys. Now, Jack Kennedy had great affection for Marilyn, even though it was indiscreet for him to continue seeing her. And he was furious that someone in the intelligence community, I don't even think he certainly didn't know about this document. He was very upset, is what I understand, that Marilyn was killed by these operatives. And he vowed to try to bring out this information himself. And I think that's why he began to speak a little more openly to this Air Force officer whose audio recording I have. And that was, of course, a year later. This happened in August of '62. The recording with the Air Force officer, that conversation with Jack Kennedy happened in 1963, June. In November, he was assassinated. As Kennedy was planning, if he had become the president, he was going to dissolve the CIA, get us out of Vietnam, disclose this information, and make peace with the Soviet Union. That's what he was going to do. And those folks in the intelligence community and the warmongers and the profiteers and the military-industrial complex said, like bloody hell you will. And that was the end of him. So that's why, although I thought they were joking initially, when I first, is this getting Is this good information for you folks? I hope it's not too much, but I'm going to cover an enormous amount today. You've got to know the background. So over this time period, from 1945, 40s to early 60s, there developed, a decision was made. I know this sounds like a joke, because everyone says it. If I tell you, I have to kill you. But there's some truth to that. So the secrecy that got developed around this issue became more and more and more restricted, even from people who were presidents or Senate Intelligence Committee members or members of the cabinet. Because another man who was killed was John Foster Dulles, shoved out of a window. Dulles was killed. He had been CIA director. He was starting to make noises about changing the direction of things, and he was also killed. Dulles Airport's named after him. So the decision was made, how do we do this without risking having to continue to engage in the wet works? And there's a guy I know at the CIA who kind of has my back, who has been there for years, PhD guy, who has a team of wet works guys. Wet works are assassinations. So wet works wet comes from blood. So, you don't want to pull the trigger on wet works if you don't have to. So they've decided here in the 50s and 60s to create so much secrecy and have it so compartmentalized and tightly held that they didn't want to risk doing that anymore, because it was really disruptive to the nation. And that is really the genesis of unacknowledged special access projects. Now, a special access project just means you have to have the clearance to get to it and be read into it, as they say in military speak. But an unacknowledged project, I just want to go through a minute how that works. Let's say that this gentleman is a 4-star general, and I'm a colonel. I made you a 4-star general. But I'm in an unacknowledged special access project dealing with this or some other subject. It can be other things as well. If I am in an unacknowledged project, I am told, and I have one of my most senior military advisors has been in multiple of these. He was in one project that was $2 to $3 billion. He knew it was more than 2 and almost 3 billion in a project that was off the books, no accounting, president didn't know, Congress didn't know, tightly held. A military guy working with some corporate folks. And he told me, he says, here's how it works. He says, they take you to a SCIF, a Secure Communication Intelligence Facility, SCIF, take all the equipment off of you, any guns off, cell phones, watches, nothing. Anything metallic. You go into this underground facility, and there's a meeting. And he said, hey, you have a come into Jesus talk. And what happens is that you are told that only the people in that room are read into and cleared to this unacknowledged special access project. And if you speak of it outside of that circle of people, there's one person there with a gun and a bullet. He takes the bullet out and he says, it has your name on it if you speak to anyone, and I mean anyone, your wife, the president, your commander, about what we're doing. And that is how it works. This is not a conspiracy theory. I've been in these SCIFs. I've been in a couple places, and I can tell you that is exactly how it operates. So one of the things I wanted to make really clear about when I'm presenting today, I'm not talking about anything that I don't have firsthand direct knowledge of. Everything I'm telling you, every bit of it. But I don't care about conspiracy theories. They're mostly 99% wrong. And I really don't care about the internet chatter. You know, this is 25 years of the most incredible investigative research. And, you know, I put over $10 million of my earnings and life into doing to get this far. And I can tell you, if you're in an unacknowledged project, and I was offered this position back in '92, and asked my wife about it, and I rejected it. I was actually offered $2 billion personally, if a fund with $2 billion in it, if I would shut the hell up, join one of these unacknowledged projects, and do what they wanted me to do. And I said, screw you. I'm not doing it. But that's what was offered. And that's when $1 billion was a lot of money back then. Now, they're minting a billionaire every week in Silicon Valley. But, in 1992, $2 billion was a lot of money. So what ended up happening in this scenario is that if my 4-star commanding general calls me in because he's heard rumblings about something that people are working on he didn't know about, under threat of death, TWEEP, terminate with extreme prejudice, which is death, TWEP, I am to turn to him, even though he's my 4-star commanding, I'm only a colonel, and I'm to say, sir, no such project exists. That's how it works. It's illegal, it's unconstitutional, it's criminal, it's dangerous. Because once you have a breakdown in the rule of law, we're back in the jungle. We're back into Al-Qaeda territory. We're back into the Wild West where there's a lawlessness. And that's what happened. And because of that, no president since Eisenhower has had anything near the level of information on this that would be required for the chief executive. Most CIA directors haven't. There are a few who have and a few who haven't. And I'll tell you a little bit about why that's the case in a moment. Who's been in and who's out? Dick Helms was in, Woolsey was out. It's a long story, but I'll try to cover it. You guys are going to get more information. It's going to be TMI, too much information by the end of this. But this is why I'm doing this today, is that I want to leave a record of everything I've learned that's critical for the public in case, I'm 60 now, so who knows what will happen to me. So it's important to leave this. But if you're the president, don't assume that you have an all-access pass. The presidential daily briefing doesn't have anything really that critical in it, and almost never this subject. By the time you had Johnson come around, and then you had Nixon, and Nixon, by the way, was vice president for Eisenhower. Nixon actually was pulled in as head of the Space Committee. The vice president sits as chair of the Space Committee into Majestic. This group, MAJIC, M-A-J-I-C, is actually what it's called. It's the Majority Intelligence Committee, M-A-J-I-C, it's the proper term. And MAJIC tapped Nixon, and he thought as president, he would be the guy that would disclose this, because he thought it was time, and he finally became president after Jack Kennedy, he felt, swindled him out of the presidency in 1960. And then, of course, Lyndon Johnson inherited the presidency in a sense after the assassination, had one term, part of another, the rest of Jack Kennedy's term. But Nixon thought, well, okay, I'm going to do this. And so a little thing called Watergate happened. Everybody remember Watergate? Those of you too young to remember, it was the break-in over here at this office in a luxury apartment on the Potomac. And it was a bag job. Bag men went in and broke into the Democratic National Committee offices to get lists and information, and Nixon ended up covering it up. It's kind of standard operating procedure. It's like it wasn't really that big of a deal in the sense that it happens all the day, you just don't know it. But there was a guy named Woodard who was ONI. Office of Naval, Bernstein, Woodard and Bernstein, look it up. And Office of Naval Intelligence is where he came from. And suddenly this young reporter has this deep throat. Well, he had an ONI guy give him the information, Office of Naval Intelligence, because Nixon was planning to blow the lid off the secrecy. And the way they took him down was by impeachment rather than by a bullet. That's actually why Nixon was impeached. Now, he did do the Watergate, and he was a crook. But, I would say most politicians have engaged in such things. I know I'm a bit cynical about it, but, it's not that unusual for dirty tricks and oppo research to be done against someone else, and you have someone go and steal something or rifle through trash to get dirt on someone, and that's what they were doing.